I am here with Michael de Percy having a chat about what it means to have a government and what sort of civilization we would like to live in. Now, I wrote an article for Cauldron Pool back in 2021 called Everyone is Far Right of Stalin, and to be fair, it was a little bit of a cruel title in response to everyone being called far right these days, but it was essentially exploring the history of left and right. Now, the original slur of being far right was used against the capitalists during the European World Wars, where far right was basically used by the communists, the far left communist proper ones, to insult the socialists because they weren't far enough left for the communists. But the one thing that always bothered me reading the history, Michael, is that there are many European groups on the continent who like to call themselves anarchists when they were actually socialist revolutionaries. They were anarchists from the existing system, not technically anarchists who wanted a small government. They were like the anarcho-communists, those kind of people. Now, when you walk through the streets of Sydney, you still see around the universities plenty of posters urging our young kids to join anarchist movements and become anarchists, with the words socialist and Marxist printed somewhere at the bottom of the poster. Does this misuse of language from political movements throughout history confuse what people understand as left and right, and even the definition of anarchy? Kind of like how you have a People's Republic of North Korea when it's clearly not.
It's not misused. It actually represents historical interpretations, and the idea of anarchy really comes back to the ideas of Karl Marx. And what we've seen in practice in communism versus the general idea, we really need to look at it in terms of the relationships to the other ideologies. So if we look at socialism as an example, and in particular social democracy, we see the influence of socialism in the labour movement in Australia, for example, in the 1890s in the Shearers movements. And so we start seeing less of a focus on the individual and more of a focus on the group, which is from that exploitation of the capitalists in effect. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that people unite together in a common cause. But the problem for the union movement is if anybody steps out of line, they become a scab and effectively take away the union jobs. So that cohesion is essential to the survival of that union movement. And the socialist idea there, however, is not about overthrowing the government, but it's about using the government to protect the rights of workers within that economic system. Whereas communism goes a step further, and the communists want to overthrow the state. So they see the state, as in the government, the supreme authority, as representing the bourgeoisie. And the only way for the proletariat to be free is to overthrow the government, and then they can overthrow the bourgeoisie. And the problem is, this is as far as Marx went. He even said that he didn't want to write recipes for tomorrow's kitchens. And in his own lifetime, he said that people who called themselves Marxists had different ideas than he did. So, this sort of confusion, it really plays itself out in the Spanish Civil War. And if you read George Orwell's work, Farewell to Catalonia, I think that's the correct title, he was incredible. This guy was immersed in every possible thing imaginable. So what he writes is from direct personal experience. And he had the problem of the communists who were wanting to form a state with a communist ideal versus the anarchists who wanted to overthrow the state. And in effect, he had to get out of there quite quickly. And of course, this is the fascists who are involved in the fighting as well. So it's a really sort of interesting microcosm of all of those confused ideas, and the communist or the left military up against the Germans and the right-wing Spanish. They, of course, start splintering along all of these different ideological lines. So.
Well, of course, the next question after you've overthrown the government is to replace it with what? And overwhelmingly, they want to replace it with another big government, just with different variety of what they want the rulership to be. But also, Karl Marx was what I like to call a miserable shit, because he was one of those people who had all these grand ideas about the working class and worker rights and then lived off his mate for his whole life, basically. And I think he got his mate's wife pregnant or something. He was not a particularly good person, which explains a bit why his politics were pretty bad ideas as well. But keep going with your anarchy. Although I will say that the kids in the streets these days who call themselves anarchists, they want to overthrow the government because they feel oppressed somehow. But they don't want to be ruled by anybody. Are they a different anarchist to what you saw before?
No, not really, because the general idea was that once the government was overthrown, we would live in communes and everyone would live happily ever after, and we would raise children as a tribe as opposed to as families, because Marx actually saw the family as a capitalist conception that enabled the transfer of wealth from one generation within the family to the next. And he believed that if the state was overthrown, the family would disappear because it wasn't natural. And so, obviously, I have 3 younger sisters and we'd kill and die for each other, so I just don't think that that's true. Like, you don't have those feelings because of made-up socialisation. These, to me, is something that are inherently natural.
Yeah, but biology, Michael, biology makes you far right. You remember that, right? So that makes you far right if you believe in biological drives. But didn't they try the Black Lives Matter, didn't they try a whole commune? Had a little garden there where it was like for blacks and black allies, where they tried to grow their own. Was that what that was all about?
In effect, yes. And look, there are many examples in the UK and the US and elsewhere where these have been attempted and they've all ended up in absolute failure. And one of the problems, look, I urge people, go to the DDE Museum in Berlin and have a look at how bad things were before the Berlin Wall fell. They were basically living in backward times. There was no motivation, because there's no reward for effort. Basically, the reward is for compliance, and the compliance is stagnant, and that's where it ends. But look, coming back to this idea of anarchy is really important, because when that general idea was that the state was representing the interests of the wealthy class, the ruling elite, the ruling and the non-ruling elite. And so if you overthrow the state, then you can, as the working class, the proletariat, you can be free. But the trouble is the working class, the proletariat, weren't clever enough. So there had to be and this is Lenin's idea as opposed to Marx, there had to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and it would establish a state that would then train the proletariat so that they could live these communist lifestyles. And of course, every experiment in history has got to the dictatorship side, and that's where it stopped. It never went any further. And so that's one of the big problems, is because they're pretending that we can live without government, which goes back to Hobbes, who created out of anarchy to protect enable us to live lives that are worth living, whereas the communists want to take us back to a state of anarchy to get rid of the state, which means that, well, we're going to be back in the same position we started with Hobbes.
You've got to love people who want to get rid of the state by creating the most powerful state possible, imaginable. But the Liberal Party, sorry about my voice, I'm recovering from the flu. The Liberal Party of Australia is called a right-wing party because it values a smaller system of government. On the spectrum, it tends toward, well, my version of anarchy, but we'll just call it less government rule instead of the whole total government rule. Now, that's in theory, although I'd argue it's taken a few steps toward higher government rule in the last couple of years. Do you agree with some of the accusations that have been running around in social media lately that Australia's Liberal Party and Australia's Labor Party have become somewhat of a uni-party because they share the same ideas on some of the most crucial society-changing motions that we have in place now? I know they're not the same party, but on things like digital ID, they're the same. Net zero, they're the same. These sorts of important, like going cashless, they're the same. Is it sort of like being under a semi-uni party here?
I think a lot of this we could put down to what's called technological determinism. We're not really creating technology that we need, but we're creating technology that then dictates how we live. And that's something that governments, I guess, are picking up on because it makes it easier to govern. And look, we have problems too. I wrote an article recently where I mentioned the German water cannon that I saw in Dresden. And to me, that was abhorrent. But at the same time, when we have people who are just destroying society and allegedly kicking in the doors of police cars, then what do we do with these people? We can't just let them get away with it. There has to be a consequence. And so it's problematic in that, how do you have a consequence that isn't fatal? And technology can help us with that. But then where's the outer edge of, the extreme of these? And the difference between the right and the left is that the right values the individual, and we have a system of liberal education which includes the ability to think for ourselves. And so we teach students how to think, not what to think. Whereas increasingly, Labor is teaching us what to think, not how to think. And so I would agree that the Labor of the Hawke and Keating era was very similar to the Liberal Party of that era. But I just don't think the coalition, and especially Labor under Albanese, I think they're going very left in almost around the 1955 DLP split way, where we see traditional Labor people are actually pulling away from the party. Well, in fact, they're saying that the party has moved away from them as opposed to they're pulling away from the party.
Perhaps I could have phrased that a little bit differently, because it's not that people feel the two parties are the same. They know Labor is worse. I mean, Labor's got like the green offshoots on the side of it, giving out just terrible, terrible ideas for our permanent safety. But there's things like, let's take a renewable energy, for instance. There's no way out for a voter. If you want to have a stable grid and you don't want to see farmland destroyed or rainforests cut down or the oceans filled with steel and concrete, you can't vote for one of the two major parties. And there's maybe a dozen major topics like that going on right now, where the two parties, they keep those two topics the same. Things like UN funding and obeying the World Health Organization rules, those sorts of things, and sustainability goals, diversity, equity, inclusion, that kind of stuff, they seem to be the same. Is it natural for, when people are frustrated about that, for minor parties to pop up? Is that part of our system of government to handle that situation, to give people an option to perhaps right the balance of scales?
I think we need to trust in our system to some extent. The fact that we're here talking about these issues and we're allowed to, or we can, well, hopefully we're allowed to, we're not cancelled, but the point is that we have the ability to think and to counteract these moves. And we even within all of the major parties, there are counter moves against their preferred platforms, and a lot of this is playing to a popular audience. Look, the way that we deal with things, though, left and right, is quite different. The left looks at government control, the right would look at market-based solutions. But during that period of rapid-fire changes in prime ministers, the prime ministers were unable to undo the immediate legacies of the previous prime minister, and then by the time they got around to it, they were replaced, and so we sort of started all over again. And I think one of the big problems is it would have been, the best solution back in the day would have been to introduce a cap and trade carbon emissions scheme, which would have a market-based solution to reducing the amount of carbon. And look, if we just accept that this is what governments are going to do as opposed to should they be doing it, then we could have come up with solutions that didn't involve people's farmland being overtaken by wires and poles and windmills and things like this. So, that sort of approach to small government, I don't think it's so much about anarchy, but it puts more of a burden of responsibility onto the individual as well, because we used to have classes on citizenship. Citizenship and democracy were part of our upbringing at school. We used to salute the flag at the morning parade. We had this idea of social cohesion. Now, this has been completely undone, and I think the results indicate that we've lost the plot as a result of doing that.